The dressing room door slammed with a violence that made the gold records on the wall rattle. It was March 1978, somewhere between Cleveland and Detroit on the Kiss Alive 2 tour, and two men who had built an empire together were about to destroy it in less than 5 minutes. Paul Stanley's knuckles were white as he gripped the back of a metal folding chair. Ace Frehley stood near the mirror, his silver Space Ace makeup half removed, revealing the face of a man who looked like he hadn't slept in days. The air between them crackled with something more dangerous than the pyrotechnics they'd just unleashed on 20,000 screaming fans. What happened in that room that night would fracture Kiss forever. But the real story, the one that's been whispered about in rock circles for over 4 decades, goes far deeper than a simple argument between bandmates. This was the moment when Paul Stanley looked at his lead guitarist and said words that would echo through Ace Frehley's mind for the rest of his life. Words that would change not just Kiss, but the entire trajectory of rock music in the late 70s. And the strangest part? The fight wasn't really about what everyone thought it was about. Before we dive into the heart of this story, into that Cleveland dressing room where the foundations of the world's biggest rock band began to crack, I need you to understand something crucial. If you're watching this, if you remember buying Kiss albums at record stores, if you stood in line for concert tickets, if you understand what it meant when someone said they were a Kiss Army member, then hit that subscribe button right now. Because what I'm about to tell you has never been told this way before, and you're going to want to follow along for every revelation. To understand why Paul Stanley and Ace Frehley ended up in that explosive confrontation, you have to rewind 3 months. January 1978. Kiss was at the absolute peak of their powers, a merchandising and cultural phenomenon that transcended music. They had their own Marvel comic book, printed with ink mixed with their actual blood. They were on lunchboxes, action figures, pinball machines. Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley had built something that went beyond a band. It was a mythology, a brand, an empire that generated millions of dollars every month. But inside that empire, something was rotting. Ace Frehley, the Space Ace, the cool, mysterious guitarist with the silver makeup and the smoking guitar, was becoming a problem. Not in the way you might think, though. The drugs and alcohol that would later define his reputation were already present, yes, but they weren't the core issue yet. The real problem was much more complicated, much more threatening to everything Paul and Gene had built. Ace Frehley was becoming a creative force that couldn't be controlled. In January 1978, Kiss management had made a decision that seemed brilliant on paper, but would prove catastrophic in execution. All 4 members of Kiss would release solo albums on the same day. September 18, 1978. 4 albums, same day, massive marketing push. It would be the ultimate demonstration of Kiss's dominance. Gene Simmons, the demon, the businessman, the driving force behind Kiss's empire. Paul Stanley, the Starchild, the voice, the frontman who commanded every stage. Peter Criss, the cat, the drummer with the soulful voice. And Ace Frehley, the Space Ace, the mysterious guitarist who said less, but somehow connected with fans in ways the others couldn't quite understand. The plan was simple. Prove that Kiss was bigger than any individual member, that each piece of the machine was interchangeable and powerful on its own. But what Paul Stanley and Gene Simmons didn't anticipate, what kept Paul awake at night in those early months of 1978, was that Ace's solo album might actually be good. Not just good, great. And not just great, better than anything Kiss had done in years. By March, the solo albums were well into production. Paul had heard rumors from producers, from studio engineers, from people who'd been in the room when Ace was recording. The Space Ace, who everyone thought was just the quiet guitarist, the guy who showed up, played his parts, and collected his check, was creating something extraordinary. He was writing songs that were catchier than anything on the last 3 Kiss albums. He was singing, actually singing, and his voice had this raw authenticity that made Paul's polished rock star vocals sound calculated by comparison. And worst of all, Ace was doing it without the Kiss makeup, without the stage show, without the mythology. He was doing it as Paul Daniel Frehley from the Bronx, and it was working. The tour was grinding through its 47th city. Cleveland Arena, 15,000 capacity, sold out in 3 hours. Kiss performed with their usual precision, the show a well-oiled machine of flashpots, blood-spitting, fire-breathing, and guitar solos. But anyone paying close attention that night would have noticed something off. During Paul's signature moment in Love Gun, when he usually moved to stage left near Ace's platform, he stayed center stage. During Ace's solo in Shock Me, when Paul typically came over to share the spotlight in a moment of guitar hero brotherhood, he remained on the opposite side of the stage. The tension had been building for weeks, visible to anyone in the Kiss inner circle. Road crew members noticed that Paul and Ace were no longer traveling on the same section of the tour bus. Their pre-show ritual of sharing a drink and going over the set list had stopped. Gene Simmons, always the diplomat, always the businessman, had tried to smooth things over, but even he was starting to realize this was deeper than typical band drama. The show ended with their traditional finale, Rock and Roll All Night, with confetti cannons and streamers filling the arena while 15,000 fans sang along. The 4 members of Kiss took their bows, raised their instruments, and walked off stage with smiles frozen behind their makeup. But the moment they passed through the curtain, those smiles vanished. Paul Stanley kept walking past the usual backstage area where the band would typically gather, cool down, and decompress after a show. He went straight to the dressing room, the private one designated for band-only meetings. Ace, confused and exhausted, followed. Gene started to come too, but Paul held up a hand. "Not now, Gene. This is between me and Ace." Peter Criss, never one for confrontation, disappeared toward the catering area. The door closed, and for about 30 seconds, there was silence. Then the shouting started. Road crew members in the hallway couldn't make out exact words at first, but the tone was unmistakable. Paul's voice, usually so controlled and measured, was raised to a level none of them had heard before. Ace's responses came in shorter bursts, defensive, confused. The argument escalated quickly, too quickly, like it had been waiting to explode for months and had finally found its moment. Then came the sound of something hitting the wall, hard enough that people in the corridor flinched. And then cutting through everything, Paul Stanley's voice became crystal clear. "You're not Kiss anymore, Ace. You're something else." The room went silent after that. Not the silence of resolution, but the silence of something breaking that can't be fixed. When the door finally opened 20 minutes later, Ace walked out first. His Space Ace makeup was completely removed now, revealing Paul Daniel Frehley's face. His eyes were red. He didn't look at anyone as he walked down the hallway toward the tour bus. Paul emerged a few minutes later, his Starchild makeup still intact, his expression unreadable. He found Gene Simmons and said something brief. Gene's face went carefully neutral. Whatever Paul had told him, it was serious. Here's what most people think that fight was about: Ace's drinking and drug use, his unreliability, his tendency to show up late or not at all, his lack of commitment to the Kiss brand and image. And sure, those things were part of it, contributing factors in the toxic stew that was brewing in the band by 1978. But they weren't the core issue. The real reason Paul Stanley confronted Ace Frehley that night in Cleveland was much more threatening to Kiss's future. Paul had gotten his hands on early mixes of Ace's solo album the week before. Through studio contacts, through producers who owed him favors, through the network of people who fed information to Kiss management. And what he heard terrified him. Not because it was bad, because it was phenomenal. Ace had recorded a version of New York Groove, a song originally by Hello, that was so infectious, so perfectly crafted, that Paul knew immediately it would be a hit. A big hit. Possibly a bigger hit than anything Kiss had released in years. But it wasn't just New York Groove. The entire album was solid. Songs like Rip It Out and Speedin' Back to My Baby had this raw energy and authenticity that Kiss's recent albums, polished and calculated as they were, had lost. Ace wasn't trying to be a character. He wasn't trying to maintain a mythology. He was just being himself, a Bronx kid who loved rock and roll and could play guitar like nobody's business. And that authenticity was magnetic. Paul understood immediately what this meant. When all 4 solo albums dropped on September 18th, if Ace's album was the most successful, it would undermine everything he and Gene had built. The entire concept of Kiss was that the 4 members were interchangeable pieces in a larger machine. The makeup, the characters, the mythology were supposed to be bigger than any individual personality. That's why they could license Kiss dolls and lunchboxes and comic books. Because Kiss wasn't 4 guys in a band. Kiss was a brand, a concept, a bulletproof mythology. But if Ace Frehley, the quietest member, the one who barely spoke in interviews, the one who was supposed to be just the cool guitarist, could step out from behind the Space Ace makeup and be more successful on his own terms than he was as part of Kiss, then the entire mythology collapsed. It would prove that Kiss wasn't greater than the sum of its parts. It would prove that the parts themselves, the actual human beings behind the makeup, were what mattered. And that threatened every future dollar Kiss would ever make. In that Cleveland dressing room, Paul laid it out for Ace in terms that left no room for misinterpretation. The solo album situation had forced a reckoning that had been brewing since the band's inception. Paul told Ace that his album was too good, too authentic, too him. It threatened the balance of power within Kiss, and more than that, it threatened the carefully constructed illusion that Kiss was 4 equal parts of a perfect machine. According to people who were briefed on the conversation later that night, Paul gave Ace a choice, though it wasn't really a choice at all. Either Ace could recommit fully to being Space Ace, to being a character in the Kiss mythology rather than Paul Daniel Frehley, the individual artist, or he could pursue his solo vision and eventually leave the band. There was no middle ground. You couldn't be a character and a person at the same time. Not in Paul Stanley's vision of Kiss. You had to choose. And here's where the story gets really interesting, where it deviates from the standard rock and roll narrative of creative differences and personal conflicts. Because Ace didn't choose, not right away. He stood there in that dressing room, makeup half removed, and he asked Paul a question that cut to the heart of everything. He asked Paul if he, Paul Stanley, was happy. If playing a character every night, if maintaining the Starchild persona even when the cameras were off, if building an empire that treated them all as interchangeable pieces, if all of that made Paul happy. Paul didn't answer. Couldn't answer, maybe, Because the truth was complicated. Paul Stanley loved Kiss. He loved performing, loved the stage, loved the connection with fans. But was he happy? That was a different question entirely. And Ace's question exposed something Paul had been avoiding for years. The possibility that the empire they'd built, the mythology they'd created, had trapped them just as much as it had liberated them. The remaining months of the tour were professional but cold. Kiss continued to perform their shows with mechanical precision, delivering exactly what fans expected. But backstage, the warmth and camaraderie that had defined the band's early years was gone. Paul and Ace barely spoke outside of necessary band business. Gene tried to mediate, but even his diplomatic skills couldn't bridge the fundamental philosophical divide that had opened up. As the solo albums neared their release date, the tension only increased. Kiss management was pumping millions into marketing, promoting all 4 albums equally, maintaining the fiction that each member's solo work would be equally successful. But inside the band, everyone knew that wasn't going to happen. The advance buzz around Ace's album was too strong. Radio stations were already requesting advance copies of New York Groove. Music critics who'd dismissed Kiss as a cartoon show were suddenly interested in hearing what the Space Ace could do on his own. Paul threw himself into promoting his own solo album, doing more interviews, more appearances, more everything. It was a competition he'd never wanted to have with his own bandmate, but one he couldn't avoid. And underneath all the professional promotion and marketing, there was a current of genuine fear. Fear that Ace had been right. Fear that the mythology they'd built was actually limiting them rather than empowering them. When the 4 Kiss solo albums were finally released simultaneously, it should have been a triumph. The marketing was massive. Record stores set up special displays with all 4 albums. Kiss Army members debated which one to buy first. It was exactly the kind of cultural moment Kiss had become experts at creating. But the results were not what Paul Stanley and Gene Simmons had hoped for. Ace Frehley's album was the runaway success. New York Groove hit number 13 on the Billboard Hot 100, making it the highest charting single any Kiss member would ever have as a solo artist. The album itself went platinum, the only one of the 4 solo albums to achieve that certification during the initial release period. Critics praised its authenticity and energy. Fans loved it. And most importantly, it proved that Ace Frehley didn't need the Space Ace makeup to connect with audiences. Paul Stanley's album was solid, professional, exactly what you'd expect from Kiss's frontman. It did respectable business, but didn't match Ace's commercial or critical success. The hierarchy was clear. Ace Frehley, the quiet guitarist who was supposed to be just another cog in the Kiss machine, had proven he was the most commercially viable member of the band as an individual artist. And that changed everything. The years following the solo albums saw Kiss enter a period of creative and commercial decline that would ultimately lead to Ace's departure in 1982. The Dynasty album in 1979 featured I Was Made for Lovin' You, a disco-influenced track that was a huge hit, but alienated many longtime fans. Ace hated the song, refused to play on the final version, and his guitar parts were eventually replaced by session musician Bob Kulick. It was a symbolic moment. The Space Ace was no longer essential to Kiss's sound. Throughout this period, Ace's relationship with Paul deteriorated further. The Cleveland confrontation had set a tone that never improved. They were professional colleagues, nothing more. The creative collaboration that had produced classic Kiss tracks was gone. Ace showed up, did his parts, and left. The spark, the magic that happens when artists genuinely connect and create together, had been extinguished that night in March 1978. Ace's personal struggles with alcohol and drugs intensified during this period, though it's impossible to separate cause and effect. Was he self-medicating because of the tensions in Kiss? Or were the tensions partly caused by his substance abuse? Probably both, in a vicious cycle that pulled him deeper into isolation. The Space Ace character, which had once been empowering, now felt like a prison. He was trapped inside a mythology that denied his individual humanity. Paul Stanley, for his part, became increasingly controlling about Kiss's direction. With Ace mentally and emotionally checking out, Paul and Gene took tighter control of every aspect of the band. The Unmasked album in 1980 barely featured Ace at all. Session musicians played most of the guitar parts. The Space Ace was there in the videos and in concert, but the actual musical contribution from Paul Daniel Frehley was minimal. Ace Frehley played his final concert as an official member of Kiss on December 13, 1982, in Japan. By that point, his departure had been inevitable for years. The official story was creative differences and Ace's desire to pursue solo projects. The real story was that the Cleveland confrontation had never been resolved. The fundamental question that Ace had asked Paul, can we be both characters and people, or do we have to choose, had been answered definitively. In Kiss, you had to choose, and Ace chose to be a person, even if it meant leaving behind the mythology he'd helped create. Paul Stanley watched Ace leave with mixed emotions. Relief, certainly. The tension and unpredictability would be gone, but also regret, though he'd never admit it publicly. Because Paul knew that something irreplaceable was leaving with Ace. The chemistry, the balance that made classic Kiss work, was walking out the door. Future lineups would feature technically proficient guitarists who hit every note and never caused problems. But they would never have what Ace brought to Kiss in those early years. Authenticity, rawness, a connection to something real underneath all the smoke and makeup. Looking back now, over 4 decades later, the Cleveland confrontation between Paul Stanley and Ace Frehley stands as a defining moment not just in Kiss history, but in rock music itself. It encapsulated a fundamental tension that every successful band faces: the balance between individual artistry and collective identity, between being true to yourself and serving something larger than yourself. Paul Stanley wasn't wrong to protect Kiss's mythology. That mythology had made them one of the biggest bands in the world. But Ace Frehley wasn't wrong either. His insistence that there should be room for humanity within the mythology was equally valid. The tragedy is that Kiss couldn't find a way to embrace both truths. The mythology won, as it usually does. Kiss continued for decades with various lineups, always with the makeup, always with the characters, always with the brand intact. But in winning, something was lost. The human connection, the realness that Ace brought to Kiss, faded away. Later versions were more professional, more polished, more controlled. But they were also more hollow. Ace spent the next 4 decades proving he'd been right all along. His band Frehley's Comet produced critically acclaimed music. His solo work in the 2000s and 2010s saw a career renaissance. Albums like Anomaly and Space Invader received the best reviews of his career, not because of the character, but because of the guitarist behind the character. Paul Daniel Frehley, with his bluesy bends and melodic solos and genuine love for rock and roll. The Cleveland dressing room where they fought is long gone, demolished, and rebuilt. But the question that exploded between them that night in March 1978 remains, echoing through rock history. Can you be both the character and the person? Should you even try? Or do you have to choose, the way Ace and Paul ultimately did, and accept that in choosing, you sacrifice something irreplaceable. There's no easy answer. There never was. But the fact that we're still asking the question 46 years later, still debating who was right and who was wrong, suggests that the question itself matters more than any answer we might find. Paul Stanley and Ace Frehley gave us more than just great rock music. They gave us a story about identity, about the masks we all wear, and about the price we pay for them. And that story, unlike Kiss itself, will never end.